What adjustments are we to expect?
Well, I think we are already seeing those changes taking place in terms of governance structures, right? So we have the G20 as being a key body that is looking at a lot of these issues. It's no longer just the G7 or G8. I think if you look at the WTO, it's very important to try to have some reform of the WTO decision-making process, because a lot of these countries like China and India and Brazil have played a less important role in the past, and clearly now in the global trading system, they're going to play a much more important role. So I think we will have to have reform of these institutions, whether it's the IMF or it's the WTO or what have you. Some countries, of course, are resistant to that, right? The French still have a position in the Security Council. I'm not against the French, but that's very hard to justify in this particular situation because of what happened after 1945. So power has been frozen based on who the winners and losers were in 1945, but 60 or 70 years later, that's not realistic. So there will need to be an adjustment in power sharing in international institutions, and that of necessity, because power in the particular institutions is 100%, it's a zero-sum game. Some countries will have to give up some of their voting shares, for example, in the IMF, and they may have to do it kicking and screaming, but they're going to have to do that.
Will the US dollar see a slow decline of its role as the world's reserve currency?
Yeah, I don't think that's going to happen immediately. I mean, unless these currencies like the rupee or the yuan become convertible on capital account, on current account, on all accounts, not just on some areas, I think it's going to be very difficult to have these currencies playing a key role. I think over time the euro will be more and more important. I think the dollar will continue to maintain some of its position. I don't believe that the dollar is on the verge of collapse. I don't think that's going to happen. I think there is, of course, now people are worried about inflation and U.S. deficit and so on, so the dollar is much weaker. I don't think that's a secular decline. I don't think the euro will be at $3 to the euro anytime soon, and I think we've seen cycles. In fact, over the last 7 or 8 years, if you look at the euro, it's gone up and down quite a bit, and so I'm not convinced that we're now seeing the collapse of the dollar.
Will the Chinese yuan then increase its influence on world trade?
Well, if the Chinese yuan becomes completely convertible and it becomes a real currency the way the United States dollar is, that people can hold dollars, move them around, move them in and out, no capital controls of any kind, I think that will give the Chinese yuan a greater role. It's not a terrible thing if other currencies play a significant role. There are some benefits to being the key currency, but those benefits are sometimes outweighed by speculation in that currency or concerns about that currency as well. So I do think it's probably healthy over time that more currencies carry the burden of the global economy in terms of liquidity provision in the global economy. But I don't think we're going to see that transformation in the next 2 or 3 years. It's going to take time for that to happen.
The facts tell that the US is deeply in debt, and its deficits are only projected to grow in the years to come. Will the US be able to sustain these debts in the long term? Surely there must be a correction of the imbalance sooner or later. If there must be a correction, what consequences are we to expect?
Well, we've already seen the first consequence, that if you have a very huge trade deficit, there is a correction. And so, in fact, the fact that the dollar is declining will actually lead to increased competitiveness for the United States economy in selling goods abroad, right? So that's the first correction we've seen. Second correction we've seen is that there's a declining demand for some foreign goods because of the higher savings rate. So that correction is taking place as Americans save more. So that's also taking place and underway. In terms of the huge government budget deficits, I mean, people get very excited about it, and I'm not for massive government deficits. But if the U.S. grows more rapidly, the U.S. is more than a 10 trillion economy, and so those deficits can be paid off. Now, the danger is, of course, that politicians get attached to deficit spending and think that there's no consequence for spending as much money as you want. That would be a very dangerous development. I don't see the Obama administration doing that right now, and I think people are very concerned about that, but I do think there is a great deal of fiscal responsibility in the Democratic Party, at least in many sectors, and in the Republican Party, of course, but it will take some time to start absorbing back some of this deficit spending that the United States has engaged in. So that does take time, but I think that the signal that the U.S. sent in the economy, by intervening in the economy, by taking over some of these firms that were completely failing, by increasing the money supply. Those are very important actions it took in saving the global economy. And as we talked about earlier on with the Great Depression, I think there was a very slow response. And so the notion that let markets work completely when the things are collapsing, I think is completely wrong. I think the fact that the U.S. was able to send a signal, and not just the U.S., Britain, other countries, the Chinese played a very crucial role with their stimulus package. So I think the fact that governments individually and to some extent in coordination responded to the crisis has led to a very different outcome than we might have had, as we did have in the 1930s. And that's a healthy thing, and it shows some learning. So I'm kind of optimistic still about the global economy. I do worry about excessive deficit, excessive government spending, and the rebalancing of the global economy, but that's a process that is underway already, and it's not something that we should be very surprised about.